Pride and Prejudice is a 2005 American romantic drama film based on Jane Austen's novel of the same name. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. The film stars Keira Knightley, Matthew Macfadyen, and Brenda Blethyn. It was directed by Joe Wright and adapted by Deborah Mogak. The runtime is 129 minutes. The story follows Elizabeth Bennet, the second of 5 daughters in the Bennet family. Their family lacks wealth, and their mother is socially inept, eagerly aiming to marry her daughters off to wealthy men to ensure their future. When the wealthy Mr. Bingley moves into the nearby Netherfield estate with his sister Caroline, Mrs. Bennet sets her sights on him for one of her daughters. Mr. Bennet invites them to a ball where Mr. Bingley and Elizabeth's older sister Jane show mutual interest. But Mr. Bingley's friend Mr. Darcy seems aloof and arrogant. When the wealthy Mr. Bingley moves into the nearby Netherfield estate with his sister Caroline, Mrs. Bennet sets her sights on him for one of her daughters. Arrogant. Mr. Bennet invites them to a ball where Mr. Bingley and Elizabeth's older sister Jane show mutual interest, but Mr. Bingley's friend Mr. Darcy seems aloof and Elizabeth overhears Mr. Darcy telling Mr. Bingley that she is not beautiful enough to tempt him, cementing her initial impression of Darcy as prideful and condescending. Meanwhile, a militia regiment arrives in town, and Elizabeth befriends Mr. Wickham, a charming officer who shares a complicated history with Mr. Darcy. Wickham tells Elizabeth that Darcy denied him an inheritance, increasing her disdain for Darcy. Mr. Collins, a pompous clergyman and cousin to the Bennet family, proposes to Elizabeth. He is set to inherit the Bennet estate, and Mrs. Bennet pressures Elizabeth to accept the proposal. Elizabeth refuses, and Mr. Collins marries her friend Charlotte Lucas instead. As Mr. Bingley grows closer to Jane, he suddenly leaves for London, urged by Darcy and his sister. Jane is heartbroken and goes to London to stay with her uncle. Elizabeth visits Charlotte, now living near Darcy's Aunt Lady Catherine. During a visit to Lady Catherine's estate, Darcy begins to show interest in Elizabeth. Elizabeth learns from Darcy's servant that Darcy persuaded Bingley to break off his relationship with Jane, believing her family unsuitable. Elizabeth confronts Darcy, who confesses his love but is rejected by Elizabeth, citing his interference with Jane and his mistreatment of Wickham. Darcy writes Elizabeth a letter explaining his actions. He reveals that Wickham squandered his inheritance and attempted to elope with Darcy's sister. Darcy believed Jane did not love Bingley and was protecting his friend. Elizabeth, now reconsidering Darcy's character, visits his estate and is surprised by his warm reception and his introduction of his sister. Meanwhile, Elizabeth learns that her youngest sister Lydia has eloped with Wickham, endangering the family's reputation. Darcy secretly arranges their marriage, saving the Bennets from disgrace. Mr. Bingley returns to Netherfield and proposes to Jane. Elizabeth and Darcy meet again, and he proposes. She accepts, having learned of his true character and the lengths he went to help her family. They marry and live happily together.